This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because, of course, this has enormous implications. So as we go through this opinion now with our team, another outstanding question is what now happens to all that revenue that had been collected. This is something that it really wasn't clear from the arguments what they would say about that, if they're going to lay out a plan. So we will continue to go through this, but this is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump before this conservative court.
This is, Paula, a major slap at the President of the United States, who has made a major effort over these many, many months.
Recently, the Supreme Court delivered a major blow by ruling that President Trump's emergency tariffs are illegal. The decision matters not only because of its economic impact, but because it cuts directly into presidential power. Billions of dollars have already been collected under those tariffs, so the stakes are enormous. What makes this even more striking is that it is the first major ruling from this highly conservative court against Trump since he returned to office in January. The case was fast-tracked because of its importance, and now the big question is what happens next to all that money. It is a huge and unusually damaging ruling for Trump before this court, and the pressure does not stop there. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the second highest court in the country, has now rejected his final immunity argument, making clear that no president is above the law. The court threw out Trump's sweeping claims of immunity, meaning the possibility of prosecution and even prison time is no longer theoretical or distant. It could come sooner than many expected. At the same time, the tariff issue leaves another massive problem hanging over the administration. Over recent months, roughly $150 billion has been brought in through these measures. Now, the obvious question is whether that money must be returned to the businesses that paid it. That issue hovered over the court arguments because this case is ultimately about a basic constitutional limit. A president cannot impose sweeping tariffs on his own without Congress authorizing it. That has always been the core problem. Trump has repeatedly tried to stretch executive power, and during the November arguments, which lasted more than 2.5 hours, the justices appeared deeply skeptical that he could rely on a vague federal statute to justify global tariffs. They seem to be moving toward declaring the policy unlawful. Now that they have, the unresolved issue is what happens to the revenue already collected. Trump himself has treated this as a monumental case, and for good reason. It is not just a defeat on trade. It is a ruling about the limits of his power, arriving just as another major court has also stripped away his immunity defense. The White House and the Justice Department argued this case on his behalf, and now everyone is waiting to see how they respond to a decision with huge legal, financial, and political consequences.
And just to look at some of the background I have here, over these many months, the administration has collected $150 billion in these tariffs. So what happens to that money? Do they have to refund that money to the firms, to the people who paid for those tariffs?
That's one of the big questions that came up at arguments, and it's something that we're looking through now in this opinion. The top line is that these are illegal, that the president cannot rely on this 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs without authorization from Congress, because this question is really about the extent of presidential power. And we know in both his terms in office, President Trump has really worked at the edges of what has largely been recognized as executive authority. But in these arguments back in November, they went on for 2.5 hours, it was clear that the justices were skeptical that President Trump could rely on this vague federal law to impose global tariffs. Now, they did appear to likely be willing to decide that these were illegal, but what is not clear, we haven't gotten to this part of the opinion, is what happens to all that revenue that has been collected by the government. And President Trump has said himself that this is, this is a massive decision for him. So we're waiting for reaction, both from the Justice Department that argued this on his behalf and also from the White House. But we're going to keep going through this, Wolf.
Now let's shift gears, because Trump is also staring at something almost surreal: conviction and possible prison time for contempt of court. Not just political damage, but the real possibility of a sitting president ending up behind bars. And he clearly feels the heat, because prison is no longer some distant hypothetical for him. It is suddenly real. Trump's legal team tried to argue that, as president, he is protected by immunity from criminal prosecution for actions taken in office. They claimed the Constitution shields a sitting president from criminal accountability, but the appeals court rejected every part of that argument. The court made it crystal clear: presidential immunity is not a free pass, and it does not protect criminal contempt of court. If a president violates court orders, intimidates witnesses, and obstructs proceedings, he can be prosecuted and he can go to prison. The ruling was unanimous. No dissent, no ambiguity, no judge suggesting Trump had a real case. Just one blunt conclusion: Trump is not above the law, and the court did not leave room for delay. It fast-tracked the case and made clear that Judge Merchan's contempt findings can be enforced immediately. That means Trump could face sentencing very soon, potentially within days, and prison within weeks. That is what makes this so explosive. Judge Merchan found Trump in contempt 10 separate times. At 30 days per violation, that means he could theoretically face up to 300 days behind bars, nearly a year. Even if the sentence is lighter, jail is now a real possibility. These violations are tied to Trump's attacks on witnesses and jurors in the Iran war case. He used social media to insult witnesses, threaten jurors, and intimidate people involved in the proceedings. That is witness tampering. That is obstruction. That is contempt of court. And even after repeated warnings and fines, he kept doing it. The judge cited him 10 times, and now the appeals court has confirmed those findings are fully enforceable. The case also ties back to the leaked Pentagon memos and allegations that Trump used military operations for political gain while trying to suppress evidence and keep damaging facts from surfacing. He has been attacking witnesses because he knows that if the full record comes out, it could be devastating. So he kept pushing, trying to scare people off, bury evidence, and pressure jurors. But both the trial court and the appeals court have now drawn a hard line. Court orders apply to him too, and if he breaks them, prison is on the table. That is why Trump is now trapped in an almost impossible position. He can comply with the court, stop attacking witnesses, stop trying to bury evidence, and maybe reduce the damage. Or he can keep fighting and move even closer to prison. Those are the choices. And the problem for him is that compliance carries its own cost. If he backs down, it signals that the court has authority over him. It opens the door for testimony, evidence, and a fuller public record. But if he refuses, he risks jail. That is what makes this more than a legal setback. It is a constitutional crisis in the making. If Trump actually ends up in prison while still serving as president, the system would be forced to respond. Congress would have to act, the cabinet could invoke the 25th Amendment, or Trump could be pushed toward resignation. A president cannot realistically govern from a jail cell. If he is convicted and incarcerated, the presidency as he knows it is over. And Trump appears to understand that. Reports describe him as panicked, cornered, and running out of options. The appeals court has destroyed his immunity defense. Judge Merchan has already found him in contempt. The DOJ is now free to move ahead. Congress is pressuring for resignation. Bipartisan efforts are building to strip him of military authority. Republican senators are starting to drift away, and public support is weakening. His approval rating is down to 29%, lower than Nixon's when he resigned, and the lowest territory for any modern president. That political collapse matters because once Republicans see prison as a real possibility, the cost of abandoning him drops. Congress could accelerate impeachment rather than wait for the spectacle of a sitting president being taken to prison. The cabinet could decide that a president facing incarceration and showing signs of instability is no longer fit to serve. The vice president could be forced into the center of that decision. If that happens, Trump loses not just politically, but institutionally. the protections of the presidency disappear, and he becomes far more exposed to the full force of the law. So this ruling changes everything. It does not just allow prosecution, it wipes out Trump's core legal shield. It says presidential immunity has limits, and criminal contempt is outside those limits. It confirms that everyone, including the president, must obey court orders. Trump now faces 10 contempt counts, up to 300 days in jail, collapsing approval numbers, growing congressional pressure, and the real possibility of removal before prison ever happens. That is the real picture now. Trump has no immunity, no real legal escape, and no easy path forward. He is boxed in by the courts, squeezed by Congress, and running out of time. The rule of law is catching up to him, and he knows it. The only remaining question is not whether this is serious. It is how fast it all moves, and whether prison, removal, or resignation comes first. All right, let's slow this down, because what the Supreme Court just did is bigger than simply killing Trump's tariff program. The real story is the coalition that did it, a 6-3 majority that included Chief Justice Roberts, 3 liberal justices, and 2 Trump appointees. That mix matters. It sent a direct message to the most powerful man in the world that he had gone too far. And that is what makes this ruling so striking. This was not a liberal court ganging up on a conservative president. It was a court that had spent the previous year expanding Trump's power, suddenly deciding to draw a line. The same institution that had backed mass firings of federal workers, cuts to domestic programs, broad control over independent agencies, and sweeping criminal immunity for official acts is now telling him that one of his central economic claims crossed a constitutional boundary. That is why outlets like the Financial Times and Reuters are calling this a major blow to Trump's economic agenda. A court that had largely stood with him turned around on February 20th, 2026, and ruled 6-3 that he overreached by using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping global tariffs. That strips away one of the main tools he used to pressure allies and adversaries alike. What makes the ruling even harder for Trump to spin is that 2 of the justices in the majority were his own nominees, Gorsuch and Barrett. If this had been a narrow liberal majority, he could have fallen back on the familiar claim that the court was just another partisan enemy. But that story collapses when his own appointees join the ruling against him. He can try to call it political, but he cannot erase the fact that his own picks helped shut him down. That is the deeper significance here. For years, Trump benefited from a narrative that any ruling against him was not a neutral legal judgment, but a political attack disguised as law. This 6-3 split badly weakens that argument. It shows that even a court shaped in part by Trump was willing to say he exceeded his authority. So this is not the fall of his presidency in one stroke, but it may be the decline of the idea that the court will always protect him. There are really 3 key parts to this shift. First, the makeup of the coalition matters. A cross-ideological majority, including Trump nominees, makes the decision look constitutional rather than partisan. Second, the context matters. After spending 2025 expanding Trump's authority, this court's decision to stop him here carries even more weight. And third, the language matters. Roberts warned that Trump's reading of trade power would effectively let the executive usurp authority that the Constitution gives to Congress. That word, usurp, is not casual language. It means the court saw more than a policy dispute. It saw an executive claim that threatened the constitutional balance itself. Under the Commerce Clause, trade authority belongs to Congress. So when Trump tried to seize that power through a vague emergency statute, the court treated it as a serious separation of powers problem, not just an aggressive policy move. That is also why Roberts, Gorsuch, and Barrett are so central to the story. Roberts has long defended the court as an independent institution, not a political weapon. And Gorsuch and Barrett were supposed to be pillars of Trump's constitutional project. Instead, they applied constitutional limits against one of his flagship economic programs. That is exactly the kind of judicial independence the federal system is supposed to show, and exactly why this ruling is so damaging to Trump's usual narrative. The contrast with 2025 makes the moment even sharper. This was the same court that had already given Trump enormous room to expand executive power over staffing, spending, agencies, and criminal exposure. So when that same court says this tariff claim goes too far, the message lands harder. If even judges who were willing to stretch presidential power in other areas refused to go along here, then the overreach must have been obvious. And the consequences may not stop with tariffs. The ruling strengthens the major questions logic that lower courts can now use whenever the administration acts without clear congressional authorization. That is why the decision may ripple outward, to challenges against the 10% global tariff, to the federal court block on the $3 trillion funding freeze, and possibly to other high-stakes fights over Iran war powers, DACA applications, and broader executive claims. It suggests this may not be a one-off rebuke, but part of a wider accountability turn inside the judiciary. Trump's reaction made clear how deeply this hit. He called the ruling terrible and deeply disappointing, lashed out at the justices, and quickly tried to roll out a new 10% tariff under a different theory. That response showed the damage. This was not just a policy setback. It shook the legal foundation of one of his signature economic weapons. So the bottom line is this. On February 20th, 2026, a Supreme Court that had helped build Trump's power decided that on trade, he had finally gone too far. Not because liberals outvoted conservatives, but because a broad coalition, including 2 justices he appointed, concluded that he had crossed a constitutional line. That is why this moment matters so much. It does not just strike down a tariff program. It weakens the belief that the court Trump helped shape will let him keep pushing executive power without limit.